Question number 5, Metiria Turei.
Tēnā koe, Mr Speaker. Tēnā koutou i te whare.
Tēnā koe.
My question is to the Minister for Building and Housing and asks, ka tautoko ia I taku Pire e hoatu nōhanga wāroa ana, ngita ana tūroa ana, I runga I tana tohutohu ki te hoko whare tuatahi, ko nāianei, probably not a good time for a young family to buy, I tētahi whare I Akarana.
The Honourable Paula Bennett.
Mr Speaker, although we certainly respect what the member is trying to do as far as tenants' rights, we won't be supporting the bill. The reason being that we are genuinely concerned that it might drive up compliance costs and actually end up harming tenants more than it ends up actually helping. The government, however, is open to reforms that would encourage longer-term tenancies, and work is underway on setting up a stakeholder group on these very issues.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, Metiria Turei.
Tēnā koe, Mr Speaker. If the Minister is telling first home buyers now not to buy a house because homes are too expensive, will he at least support better tenancy rules that will create transparency around rent rises, given rents are increasing at twice the rate of wages and families can't afford that level of increase?
Well, Mr Speaker,
the Honourable Paula Bennett.
The first part of the member's statement, I believe, is taken a bit out of context, and we're certainly not telling people not to buy first home buyers. In fact, we're seeing the opposite happen, and even in my own electorate in Hobsonville Point, you can see many new homeowners buying there. However, in relation to the transparency and to some of the clauses in the bill, as I say, I think they need careful consideration. We have very concerns on this side of the House about unintended consequences and them not being positive for the tenant.
Pātai tāpiri.
Supplementary question, Metiria Turei.
Tēnā koe, Mr Speaker. If the Minister is encouraging people to stay renting because housing is so expensive to buy, will he give renters more security in their homes by removing the 42-day eviction notice, which is leading to increased levels of homelessness?
The Honourable Paula Bennett.
So I don't support the first statement by the member, but in relation to the second statement, actually 90 days is the norm, and there are exceptions that can be the 42 days. The exceptions to the 42 days are where the tenant's family, the landlord's family or themselves want to move in, or an employee, and then in the cases of where they might have sold, where it's sold, it's when there's an unconditional agreement actually signed and the new owner wants a vacant property. It's 42 days from then, not from when it goes on the market or anything else, so actually 90 days is the norm.
Supplementary question, Metiria Turei.
Is the Minister arguing that a landlord's family has more rights to that home than the tenant's family, who may well have been living in that home for many years, built their lives around the schools and work and community there, that those tenants have less rights than those other families?
Speaker.
The Honourable Paula Bennett.
Well, Mr Speaker, we believe in property rights. The landlord owns the property, and if they wish it for themselves or their family, then they only have to give 42 days notice. So, yes.
Has the Minister talked to...
Supplementary question, Metiria Turei.
Has the Minister talked to the Minister for Education about the effect on children in having to move schools every year because their parents cannot afford stable long-term tenancies in homes because of rent increases and 42-day notices?
The Honourable Paula Bennett.
Well, Mr Speaker, yes I have, and actually we agree with and share her concerns around those that are moving a lot and not actually getting settled in their communities. And that's why we have a number of things that are in place that are leading towards that, whether it's around social housing, whether it's around the work that's going on via schools and social workers in schools and other sort of programs. What we are concerned about is that some of the policies that the member's trying to put through in her bill potentially could have landlords withdrawing houses for tenants, and as a consequence of that, we think that of course will mean fewer homes and actually lead to more disadvantage for those very people that she is trying to help.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, Metiria Turei.
Does the Minister not understand how irrational it is for the Minister of Housing to be telling families not to buy a house because housing is too expensive, and yet to stay in rental accommodation when renting is, as she has said, insecure, unstable and expensive?
Speaker.
The Honourable Paula Bennett.
I know it's hard for the member to appreciate, but actually I think that there is probably agreement across the House into what we want to see as the outcomes for these people. What we disagree in is that actually the venue and the vehicle for doing that, and the member's bill at the very worst is actually careless and could lead to more actually vulnerability for those very families whom she is trying to help. We have said that we're looking at setting up a stakeholders advisory group where it can be carefully considered. We can make sure that we've got the interests of the tenants foremost in those views. We've already made changes to the Residency Tenancies Act earlier this year that I think go some way towards protecting some of the tenants' rights. Well, they do actually, and that's what we'll continue to do, but it will be in a careful and thoughtful manner that actually leads to better outcomes.